Good afternoon, everyone. Wow, this is loud. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon as we resume our science cafes. We're excited to see such a good turnout. It's a great subject. We're excited to hear from our friends from Acadia National Park. As many of you know, we have a bit of a history with the park. The MDI Biological Lab was really established due to the generosity and foresight of George Dorr and many of his colleagues who really believe strongly that this island should be a place where scientists from all over come and study and learn from nature. And so we're very excited that science seems to really be experiencing kind of a resurgence at the park, and we are super eager to hear a little bit more from our colleagues. We have Rebecca Will-Cole here with us this evening. She's the Chief Resource Management at the park, and then Abe Miller-Rushing, who is the Science Coordinator. And so they're going to talk a little bit about the ways that science is really helping to inform some of the decision-making about the park and our future, but also to combat some of the effects of a changing climate, of increased visitation, air pollution, all of these things. So that's my quick introduction, but I want to welcome you both here to our Science Cafe, and thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you. So, great. As Jerry said, I'm Abe Miller-Rushing. I'm the Science Coordinator, and do you want me to just go ahead and move on to the outline?
Yes, sir.
And so we're tag teaming this. This is a first for us. It should be fun. Happily, we get along well. You'll see exactly how well we get along here. So we're going to kind of go back and forth. So this is an outline of the talk. We're going to talk about, I'm going to start with a very brief history of science in Acadia, very brief. And then we're going to go back and forth through three little vignettes of examples of research that's going on. Managing threatened bats, building collaborations in the Intertidal, and then restoring sweetgrass harvests in the park. You can ask about other research going on, and actually throughout the whole presentation, feel free to interrupt with questions as we go. So I'm going to start with this kind of very brief history. And I'm going to actually start even at the beginning of my very brief history, just kind of acknowledging that the history of science in Acadia goes back further than I'm going to really describe. The Wabanaki have been here since at least the retreat of the glaciers 10,000 years ago. And they were doing science, developing traditional ecological knowledge in the region long before where I'm starting the story. And I'm starting the story at 1880 and Charles Eliot and the Champlain Society. Some of you are probably familiar with this story, but I'm going to just kind of go over it. So Charles Eliot was an undergraduate at Harvard in 1880, and he asked his dad this summer, or kind of probably in the spring, said, "Dad, could I borrow the family boat, and take it up to Mount Desert Island and hang out with some of my buds?" And his dad said, "Okay." But he said, as long as you do something useful while you're up there. And so what they did, this is their camp in the picture. What they ended up doing was they divided themselves into different departments. So they had a botanical department, they had a geological department, ichthyological, ornithological, all the ologies. And they...
Excuse me, do you know which one is Charles Eliot in the picture?
I do. I do. So he is this guy right here. That's Charles. For anybody over here? That guy right there. So that's Charles, and so he came up with a bunch of his buds, and they divided themselves, and they were kind of like old school scientists. They were, they kept journals. This is actually one of their journals. They wrote these reports. This is the ichthyological report. That's their flag that they rose every day. They sang a song and did so these guys were like, old school. They wrote about girls and all kinds of things in these journals. But one of the things that they noted in the journals also, it really didn't take them very long to recognize the beauty of the place and its need for protection. And so they ended up, in addition to through these reports, they did a lot of really important science. So, and they worked not only this group of undergraduates, they ended up working with locals. So this is John Redfield, who worked with Edward Rand, one of the Champlain Society guys. John Redfield was a accountant and lawyer in town, and he helped. He worked to document the flora of Mount Desert Island. So they actually compiled a full flora of Mount Desert Island in the 1880s, which has been revisited today. And so, but they also, in addition to collecting these botanical records, they were collecting geological records and bird records and fish records and all kinds of records. And if you're interested in seeing these journals, they're actually published now online through the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. These guys kept returning for 10 years and continued compiling all this science over that time. And then they went on to have careers. So Charles Eliot actually went on to have a career as a landscape architect. He worked with Frederick Law Olmsted down in Boston, very famous landscape architect. But unfortunately, Charles ended up dying very young. He died at the age of 37 of spinal meningitis. And so his dad went back to his journals. He was obviously very distraught when he died. Went back to his journals and said, and kind of was re-inspired by the journals and said, I need to, help make this vision a reality. And so his dad was in an unusual position to help make this happen. His dad was president of Harvard University at the time and was buds with George Doerr and John D. Rockefeller. And so together they ended up creating the second ever land trust in the world to protect land and then ended up donating it to the national park or to the U.S. government. And so these guys, this kind of original citizen science in Acadia, these guys were doing science not for college credit, not because they were getting paid, but as a kind of a hobby. And so that ended up leading to the creation of Acadia National Park. And Acadia is one of the only national parks with science written right into its founding legislation for why it was created in the first place. And this kind of goes into then our mission. So the Acadia was created the same year as the National Park Service broadly, and the mission of the National Park Service here is to preserve our natural and cultural resources unimpaired for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. We are basically in the forever business, which is a tough business to be in, but it's a fun one. But the language that you see here, and then kind of another interpretation of this that Starker Leopold later coined was that we were managing these places as vignettes of primitive America. So we were trying to keep things the same, largely trying to keep them as they were pre-European settlement. This was it turned out, a very difficult thing to do. And we've since discovered that it was an impossible thing to do. So this is actually the publication of the revisiting of that flora that I mentioned in the 1880s. So Glenn Milhauser and Craig Green at College of the Atlantic and colleagues ended up revisiting that and finding that 1 out of every 6 of the plants that the Champlain Society guys found are now gone from Acadia National Park. And it's not random which species have gone. So disproportionately, we've lost our orchids, our asters, roses, lilies, and other particular groups. And so this change is happening. We're not necessarily protecting everything as it was pre-European. There's lots of changes happening in our seabirds, our mercury pollution in our fish, our insect communities are changing. We've got over 300 new species to the park over the past 50 years. And acid rain and the loss kind of acid rain has changed our lakes a lot over the past years. And so keeping things the same is an impossible goal, and so we have to kind of manage change. And this is a new goal for the Park Service, and this is kind of the science that we're going to talk about, talking about how we manage change. And so this is a challenge. Conservation as a field, and these agencies were not set up to manage change. All of the language, conservation, preservation, restoration, all designed to go backwards. But things are changing, and so we're having to change how we think about it. One advantage that we have here in Acadia is that we have a research learning center. So these are 18 of these. This is one of 18 research learning centers that were established in national parks across the country in 2002. Ours is the Skudik Institute, and so it's a public-private partnership. There's the nonprofit Skudik Institute that we work with. And so our research learning center is the biggest of the 18 across the Park Service. And we were explicitly charged from the Park Service with helping to change that culture of science and really bring back science and be kind of places to do innovation and create a world in which national parks are living laboratories, science storytellers, so communication is a big thing that we do, and exemplars of using science to manage resources and enrich experiences. So that connecting the science to management is something we're really focused a lot on. And so next, we're going to go through 3 examples of how we're trying to do this. So that kind of is the brief history. And now I'm going to hand it over to Becky to go through the next bit.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to talk to you about change, for sure, what we're seeing related to these critters. So this is a little brown bat. It probably weighs about 5 ounces. And at one time, Acadia had a lot of bats, and we have a lot less of them now. This is the critter, and for those of you who are scientists here, I wanted to show you this. This is a micro image of the fungus that causes white nose syndrome, which is the disease that has created huge crashes in bat populations across North America. It's called Pseudogymnasus destructans, and destructans is a very good word for it, because what it causes is the fungus ended up coming into most of the hibernacular, the caves, or the places where bats live in the winter, and they go into the caves in huge numbers. And this, as far as we can tell, this fungus was introduced from Europe sometime around 2005 in upstate New York. And we started seeing a lot of bats doing really odd things, coming out in the winter and flapping around. And then later on, you get the white nose, which is the syndrome that is so indicative of the disease in bats. But it causes them to wake up in the winter. We started seeing this happening in Acadia in the winter of 2011 and 12, where locals and even our own biologists were seeing bats coming out in the winter. That's not what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to hibernate. But the disease causes irritation, they wake up, they become dehydrated, they lose electrolytes, and eventually it causes mortality anywhere in the neighborhood of literally 90 to 100% of certain species of bats. And this is what one of the causes, when bats, this bat was actually just 2 weeks ago, captured here in Acadia. You can see the scarring on the wings. So what the disease does, the fungus on the nose is the obvious thing, but what it does is it actually causes damage and scarring, primarily to the wing and the tail membranes of these really delicate animals. And so that's really obvious what happens. And what we've been doing in Acadia since about 2011 is to sort of look at what the results and the impact, how this has been on our bat species. So you can see this graph doesn't show you much, except that from 2008, 9, and 10, you can see pretty high, pretty normal numbers of bats in that blue line, and then we had this crash in the winters of 11 to 13, 15, where we saw very, very decreased numbers of bats throughout any trapping work in the park. And we're starting to see a little bit of increase now moving ahead, but it still is a horrible event. It's considered one of the worst population decimations of any animal that is in historical times. The only thing that's maybe comparable is what's happened to some amphibians as a result of another fungus worldwide that has caused crashes in amphibian populations. But this is the map that shows you the current status of where white nose has been detected in bats. As you can see, the densest concentrations in the Northeast, New England where we are, but just as of July of 2019, it's shown up in Washington State and British Columbia as well. So it's still very much on the radar and really devastating.
Maybe you'll get to this, but
yeah,
the surviving bats, have they developed immunity to it or resistance to it and get better? Or
So what we have seen and what other researchers are seeing is that some bats do survive. And the bat that I showed you the photograph of with the damaged wing is a bat that has survived. And we are seeing bats with that damage, pregnant and lactating females. Very small numbers of them, but we have maybe a little E population. So some bats have survived it. But the biggest problem is that most bats south of here, when they go into these hibernacula, you can have millions of bats in a cave. And if this goes in, and as it has, into caves, it persists. It's a fungus. It loves those wet, cool places. And so one of the problems that scientists are trying to tackle is how do we battle this fungus? How do we decontaminate these places where bats want to go and need to survive in the winter? So there's a lot that's not known at all about it. There's been some recent genomic research that seems to show something about what this fungus looks like and how it behaves. There's work that's being done to try to come up with a probiotic cocktail, actually. And it's just really recent stuff where they're looking at soil probiotics and that they can actually put into bat houses and other places that it seems to show some possibility of attacking and dealing with this fungus. But we're a long way from any kinds of solutions of that at all. So what we're doing here at Acadia, and what we have been doing since, as I said, the first detection in 2011, and I want to just have you aware of Bruce Connery was our wildlife biologist. Bruce retired last year, and if any of you have been here at all, you've probably met Bruce and know the work that he's been doing. But for many years, he was doing inventory and monitoring of bats. So here at Acadia, we have one of the best databases of pre-white nose populations in New England, and then the results of the crash and as we try to do response. So what our team here is doing is they're out at night trapping bats. They use these things called mist nets, which are very fine nets that can trap the bats as they fly, but doesn't damage them. They capture the bats. You can see this bat on the left. That's a female, little brown. She's got a band, thank you. And so they have been doing some recaptures, bats from last year, from 2 years ago, for example. They also put on a small tracker onto these animals. And like I said, some of these bats don't weigh any more than 3 to 5 grams. They are tiny little critters. And so part of the help for the solution is technology, right? Some of these new microcircuitry techniques where you can actually apply this tiny little tracker to a bat, and then you go out and you look for it the next day. After night they move around, they're hunting, and during the day they will go into the places where they're nesting up over the course of the day. And so our biologists will go out with antennas and do something like Erickson is doing here, up on the top of one of Bubbo, thank you. and tracking these bats. And so what we're learning is, the interesting things we're learning is as we track these bats, as we're seeing, as I said, these novel behaviors and new habitat. So imagine if you're in a place that has 38,000 acres, as Acadia does, and there used to be higher numbers of bats, and there would have been niches, and bats would have been in certain places. All bats are off now, so the bats that we have here are doing interesting things. So bats that are supposed to roost in trees are roosting in rock screes, and we're seeing bats spending time in some of our buildings. So, for example, the Brown Mountain Gate Lodge seems to be the favorite habitat for 2 different kinds of Myotis bat species as the place where they're spending their summer days. So imagine some of the implications of that if you're a park and you're managing historic structures. What are we going to do? We are going to, in the next couple of years, we're going to do a major rehabilitation of the gate lodges to protect those beautiful historic structures. But at the same time, we have to take into consideration the fact that somebody's living there that we also want to really take care of. So those are going to be interesting conversations between our facilities folks and our wildlife people, because yes, we can rehabilitate the structures, and we might exclude bats from certain places, because after all, we need to protect these structures as well. But we have to think about the implications for that management and how to balance those two things. And another place where we've done thinking about management, and I'm pointing and looking at my boss, Mike Medell, who's sitting in the back row here, because in 2015, when one of these bats was listed to the endangered species list, we recognized that a lot of the normal routine work that we were doing in the park had potential to impact bats. So for example, cutting trees along the carriage roads and the motor roads for vista management. Those trees in some places are the very places where these endangered bats were roosting, where they were having their maternity roosts. And so we had to come to some understanding of how are we going to, going forward, manage to protect bats, but also do this routine work. Well, the solution has been, a lot of this work has started to shift from a summer season work of cutting to the winter. So that in the last couple of winters in particular, our cutting crews have been working in the winter and not in the summer. And at the same time, because we didn't know what we didn't know. You know, bats crashed. We knew there were some here. We had no idea. We had a lot of work that was being done to track and to use acoustics to understand where bats might be. But we really didn't have enough information to be able to say, we can go out and cut all these trees and we won't have any issues with bats. So we're protecting habitat, first off. We're avoiding take, which is basically what that means, is we're not going to cut trees in places where it could be the potential to impact bats. And we're considering all of the myotis bat species that we have. The northern long-eareds are the ones that have been listed to the endangered species list, but we know that pretty much all of our bats are at risk because of the declines from white nose. So that's kind of the day-to-day, real-life application of managing and using some science to understand that. So I wanted to just show you if this works. This is a recent.
Is at the Brown Mountain Gate Lodge 2 weeks ago. So we're using all the science
and to apply that towards managing in the park. Okay, next.
All right.
Yes.
Do you have an idea why you've seen an uptick in the number of bats?
In the last couple of years?
Yeah.
Biologists think is because the nadir was 11, 12, 13 here, and that the populations are starting to maybe rebound a little bit from, that total devastation. And it might be because some bats they've had the disease and hopefully have some resistance to it. Yes?
You mentioned at the very beginning of your talk that this came in from Europe around 2005. Now,
Yes.
It seems fairly recent for something so devastating to come in. What happened in Europe that brought this here in 2005?
Well, it's really interesting because once the recognition of what was going on here was made, there's been a lot of research to look at this fungus exists in bat populations in Europe, but there seems to be a lot more diversity and genetically than the one that's here that seems to be really virulent. It's possible that it has been in Europe and at low levels for so long that bat populations may have gone through the same incredible crash, but now we have rebounded. Bats don't seem to have the same kinds of behavior in these hibernacula in Europe, and one of the hypotheses is that they used to, but the bats that have survived have adapted by spreading out and not being in these large winter communities anymore. So the genetic evidence seems to show that it's been in Europe for a really long time. It was introduced here as literally a virgin soil pandemic, if you will, and there was absolutely no resistance whatsoever from any of the bat populations where it came into contact. So the one possibility is, who knows, that it was introduced maybe on clothing or gear from cavers. It's incredibly resistant, like any fungus, and if you don't, don't decontaminate, it's possible that it could have come in and been spread that way. I don't think anybody really knows for sure. Thanks. Excuse me.
All right. So that was kind of what a lot of people think about when they think about federal agencies managing natural resources. And the next couple are a little bit more people-oriented toward how we're really working with communities and collaborative science. And so this one I'll talk about collaborations in the intertidal. And believe it or not, over most of the first 100 years of Acadia's existence, the intertidal was largely ignored by science. We didn't have a lot of, even when I got here 10 years ago, we didn't have a lot of science going on in the intertidal. It's not that there was none, but there just wasn't very much. And our resource management wasn't doing very much with it either. It was really, the management was really focused on forests and lakes and streams and things like that. But now that is shifting, because the intertidal is kind of facing probably all of the, if you can think of any threat that's happening in Acadia, whether it's invasive species like these green crabs, or warming temperatures, or storm surges, or sea level rise, or ocean acidification, or crowds, they're all happening to the intertidal, and they're all probably most severe in the intertidal. And so we recognized very much that we needed to turn this around and really pay a lot more attention. And at the same time, there are a lot of livelihoods that depend on the intertidal. Clamming, marine worm harvesting, among those. And actually just recently, earlier this year, there was legislation passed that allows traditional harvesting of clams and marine worms and other marine organisms to occur within Acadia. Over the first 100 years, or 100 so years of Acadia's existence, that kind of harvesting was not allowed within the boundary of the park, but now it is. And so one of the things, as we're focusing on this, and that thought is, can we work together? So researchers, the state marine patrol, our park rangers, clammers, and marine worm harvesters, these are not people that traditionally, historically, have gotten along together super well. In fact, maybe not well at all. And so the question is can we work together to really keep this intertidal healthy? And so I think about 4 years ago, three or 4 years ago, we started with a workshop to put everybody in a room and see if we could all get along and figure out how we could manage and keep this intertidal healthy. And so on the photo here, you see our head of visitor and resource protection, law enforcement in the park, with the head of the Marine Worm Harvesters Association in Maine. So get them in the room, and the rest of it, so the other picture is us working out and kind of see what happens. And believe it or not, we came out with a model, with a conceptual model, which is totally geeky, but believe it or not, we did it. And I won't walk you through it all, but just to say that model has our intertidal target, our kind of conservation target. It mapped out the threats to the health of the intertidal, and it mapped out some strategies for how to deal with these different threats. And we all kind of did this in a room, and we all, believe it or not, came to agreement for the most part. But some really common themes came up that were really important to the work. You can see them kind of highlighted up here, like respect and common understanding and communication. And so those were really key to a lot of what we were doing. And on probably, I think this was our second workshop together, we actually got, us rangers and scientists out and with the clammers and the marine worm harvesters. They were in charge, and they really showed us how they do what they do. So we actually got out and dug clams and dug marine worms in the park. They showed us how to keep our boots and keep us from losing our boots in the mud. And this was a really important part of the relationship, where we're learning from each other in terms of what we think of when we think of a healthy intertidal and how we go about getting there. And so what we've done is we've started over the past several years, we've started expanding our surveys of biodiversity as a result of this. So we have long-term monitoring in the park. We've started adding additional citizen science, targeting particular areas and indicators that we've identified through our work. And we're also working with local high schools and the local shellfish committees to test management strategies. So this is actually students from Sumner High School working with the Gouldsboro shellfish warden and testing out methods to reduce predation on clams. So for predation, especially from green crabs on clams. So to potentially restore certain clam flats that have been decimated, or just to keep other clam flats secure going forward. And these high school students were doing this science all as a part of their high school program, and they ended up presenting their results at the Fishermen's Forum to other fishermen across the state, as well as to the local Gouldsboro Shellfish Committee. And so some of the stuff that they found was really important. So they identified certain flats that the clammers and the local communities were interested in restoring, really weren't going to work because they were overrun with this milky ribbon worm, which it turned out was predating on a lot of the clams in addition to the crabs. And they also identified areas within the intertidal that were particularly promising for restoring. And so we've really continued this work. We've continued to assess, kind of going back and saying, what have we learned over the past 3 years? We've brought in new forecasts of storm surges and harmful algal blooms and other problems that threaten the intertidal. And we've expanded our crew to include folks like the aquaculture industry, like the Bar Harbor oyster farm, just right nearby here. And kind of really continuing to build that trust and collaboration. So this is really important. This is science that's being done very collaboratively, and this is Becky actually with the head of the Marine Worm Harvesters Association. And this is going to be an ongoing issue, an ongoing relationship, an ongoing project for us to continue working together to keep our intertidal healthy. And I'm going to turn it back over to Becky now to wrap it up with sweetgrass.
I'm an archaeologist by training. That's the hardest thing I ever did in my life, was to go out there and try to keep up with Fred to dig worms. Really extraordinary work. So I wanted to talk about this project, which is very near and dear to me because I said I'm an archaeologist, but an anthropologist by training and inclination, and this has been really a wonderful project for us at the park, as well as working with the Wabanaki tribes. And the talk I'm going to give in these slides are not mine. They belong to Suzanne Greenlaw, she's a member of the Holton Band of Maliseet, but she's a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Maine in the forestry program, and Michelle Baumfleck, who is an ethnobotanist working for the U.S. Forest Service. They're the co-PIs on our project to look at plant gathering, and particularly at sweetgrass in Acadia. So this is a pretty big deal for a national park. You know, our regulations and all of our information says we take nothing but photographs, leave no trace, right? And the Code of Federal Regulations says you will not collect anything in a national park. No rocks, no anything. And so that's a pretty hard thing for places that have been homelands to indigenous people for thousands of years, who have important connections to these places, and where these places are where they have lived and collected and hunted and gathered for thousands of years. So it took a long time for the Park Service to change that Code of Federal Regulations from possessing, destroying, defacing, removing, digging, or disturbing from a natural state to a regulation that said parks superintendents have the authority to enter into partnerships and develop plant gathering permitting relationships with federal tribes. And there's all kinds of sideboards to that, but let me walk you through it just a little bit because it's a really great stuff that's going on. So to get back to, Leopold and this notion of parks as vignettes of primitive America, what he meant by that when he was saying that, he talked about pre-European, places, so the wilderness of Western parks in particular. But these places were never wildernesses, right? These are places where people lived. And Yosemite was a place where the tribes tended gardens and created whole landscapes. And the Park Service, when they took over many of these places, excluded those activities, excluded that ecological function and that knowledge that indigenous people had for these places, with this notion that we're going to hold them in time and we're going to protect them as unimpaired natural places. That's really tough when it comes up against some of this notion that people have living here and have done things for a really long time. So, the example in, like I said, in Yosemite, where the tribes burned and created oak groves and managed this place. But then you have this person, Aldo Leopold, he's a famous conservationist in the Park Service mission, where he basically said the Indians didn't know what they were doing. They had no idea, and so we're going to exclude them and we're going to manage parks by leaving them alone. Doesn't work so well anyway. So the plant gathering rule change came into effect in 2016, and what it allows for, as I said, is it's a very structured kind of process where parks and tribes will engage and discuss and consult around the importance of some of these places. So the tribes have to be federally recognized. They have to have a traditional association with the place, the park, and the parks need to work with them to create an environmental assessment that says this activity will not impair park resources, because that, after all, is the fundamental purpose of parks. So for us, with the Wabanaki tribes, and there are 4 federally recognized Indian tribes in Maine, you probably all know that, they're collectively known as the Wabanaki, but they're the Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Colton Band, Maliseet, and the Aroostook Band and Micmac Indians. And so we've been consulting with members of those tribes now for the last few years towards understanding what plants might be important, what would be a reasonable allowance. The plants, are they in Acadia? And why would it be important to allow this kind of activity? And we quickly, after doing this consultation, settled on sweetgrass as being really important. And if any of you have ever been to the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance sale or event, or any events at the Abbey Museum, if you've ever seen a Maine Indian basket, it's very likely to include sweetgrass as one of the important components of it. Sweetgrass is a salt grass, has a wonderful smell, but it's also really important to the tribes for a variety of other reasons, for ceremonial purposes, for medicinal purposes, and so it's kind of the thread that's woven through the importance for the tribes here. So what we did, working with, as I said, with Suzanne and Michelle primarily as the co-PIs, was to go out and to see, does this plant, is it in Acadia? Yes, it is. What's the abundance of it? Could we set up a research project where we might be able to assess what would traditional harvesting do? What would be the impact on the plant? What might it be the impact on the salt marsh itself? And to think about that within this context of the regulation to allow for permitting of this activity in the park. So what we wanted to do, as I said, was assess the abundance and distribution and document the traditional ecological knowledge of the Wabanaki related to this plant, and create the information for a ongoing regulatory permitting that we might be able to allow in Acadia. This is where they have lived and collected and hunted and gathered for thousands of years. So it took a long time for the Park Service to change that code of federal regulations from possessing, destroying, defacing, removing, digging, or disturbing from a natural state to a regulation that said parks superintendents have the authority to enter into partnerships and develop plant gathering permitting relationships with federal tribes. And there's all kinds of, sideboards to that, but let me walk you through it just a little bit because it's a really great stuff that's going on. So to get back to, Leopold and this notion of parks as vignettes of primitive America, what he meant by that when he was saying that, he talked about pre-European, places, so the wilderness of Western parks in particular. But these places were never wildernesses, right? These are places where people lived. And Yosemite was a place where the tribes tended gardens and created whole landscapes. And the Park Service, when they took over many of these places, excluded those activities, excluded that ecological function and that knowledge that indigenous people had for these places, with this notion that we're going to hold them in time and we're going to protect them as unimpaired natural places. That's really tough when it comes up against some of this notion that people have living here and have done things for a really long time. So, the example in, like I said, in Yosemite, where the tribes burned and created oak groves and managed this place. But then you have this person, Aldo Leopold, he's a famous conservationist in the Park Service mission, where he basically said the Indians didn't know what they were doing. They had no idea, and so we're going to exclude them and we're going to manage parks by leaving them alone. Doesn't work so well anyway. So the plant gathering rule change came into effect in 2016, and what it allows for, as I said, it's a very structured kind of process where parks and tribes will engage and discuss and consult around the importance of some of these places. So the tribes have to be federally recognized. They have to have a traditional association with the place, the park, and the parks need to work with them to create an environmental assessment that says this activity will not impair park resources, because that, after all, is the fundamental purpose of parks. So for us, with the Wabanaki tribes, and there are 4 federally recognized Indian tribes in Maine, you probably all know that, they're collectively known as the Wabanaki, but they're the Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Colton Band of Maliseet, and the Aroostook Band of Micmac Indians. And so we've been consulting with members of those tribes now for the last few years towards understanding what plants might be important, what would be a reasonable allowance. The plants, are they in Acadia? And why would it be important to allow this kind of activity? And we quickly, after doing this consultation, settled on sweetgrass as being really important. And if any of you have ever been to the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance sale or event, or any events at the Abbey Museum, if you've ever seen a Maine Indian basket, it's very likely to include sweetgrass as one of the important components of it. Sweetgrass is a salt grass, has a wonderful smell, but it's also really important to the tribes for a variety of other reasons, for ceremonial purposes, for medicinal purposes, and so it's kind of the thread that's woven through the importance for the tribes here. So what we did, working with, as I said, with Suzanne and Michelle primarily as the co-PIs, was to go out and to see, does this plant, is it in Acadia? Yes, it is. What's the abundance of it? Could we set up a research project where we might be able to assess what would traditional harvesting do? What would be the impact on the plant? What might it be the impact on the salt marsh itself? And to think about that within this context of the regulation to allow for permitting of this activity in the park. So what we wanted to do, as I said, was assess the abundance and distribution and document the traditional ecological knowledge of the Wabanaki related to this plant, and create the information for a ongoing regulatory permitting that we might be able to allow in Acadia if it worked out. So this was really interesting, because what I did when we started this project was, of course, brought in an ethnobotanist a traditional person with a lot of ecological knowledge, but we also involved and I'm going to call him a traditional Western scientist botanist friend who went out and did the analysis, went out into all the salt marshes in Acadia and said, yeah, sweetgrass is here, this is its abundance, here's what you might be able to find. And so in order to start the process of the scientific analysis of gathering and what its impact might be on the plant was to set out, we did this the way you would do any kind of a good botany project. We laid out transects and we said, you gatherer, you're going to go out and you're going to gather in this plot, you're going to pick the grass from that, and then we're going to count the stems and we're going to weigh it and we're going to come up with a very scientific methodology for assessing the impacts of harvesting on the sweetgrass. Well, that didn't go over so well with people who had a lot more knowledge of this plant and how it needs to be harvested and how it needs to be cared for than we did as Western scientists, quote unquote. And what we clearly learned was when you go out and spend time with someone, they could, an elder, she could stand at the on the edge of the road looking out at Bass Harbor Marsh and say, that's a great place to gather grass for ceremonial purposes, but I want this long grass that's over here if I'm going to make baskets. Or that kind of intimate knowledge and mapping of landscape, even in a place where people have been excluded for 100 years, because it's so intrinsically important information to these people. And so what we quickly learned by following the gatherers around, and Suzanne, who's part of the community, has just been marvelous here, was to spend time with people and have them say, this is what I know. And I know a lot about this plant. And we know a lot about how we might gather it in such a way that we would protect the resource. And because after all, that's the whole purpose, right? These people. And so it was a remarkable and wonderful experience to spend time with, as I said, people who had the traditional knowledge of the plant and how to gather it, and with elders and children, bringing out babies, because that's how you do it. You do it as a family. And so we're learning a lot about the meaning and the significance of harvesting, that harvesting is good for the salt marshes, at least for the sweetgrass probably. And so we're building both the kind of these twin bodies of information, one around the harvesting and what it does, and if you say a scientific or a Western science botanical knowledge, but also pairing that with the intimate information about how we can perpetuate this and potentially allow for this work to go on and the connections of these people to this place. So where we're at with that is working on setting up we got a group of gatherers who are the advisors to this project informally, and working on collecting collaborative writing and sharing this in a way that's pretty profoundly different than the way we often do things in a national park in terms of doing science, or bringing in a researcher who goes out and gathers information and writes a report and gives it to us, and then we use it. This is very relational and transactional and requires spending a good deal of time with people. And so for me, that's really where this one lies, is who are the experts? Clearly the people who know what they're doing, and the consultation, talking with people, asking them, and understanding the methodology from the perspective of the indigenous knowledge has been really just a wonderful project for me. So it's all about me, right? So any questions on that? We're pretty much close to the end, and then we'll have more.
Yeah, is there a parallel gathering going on for medicinal plants? Do the native healers have an option, or do they have to start from scratch?
Well,
set it up?
There's some work that's happening in other national parks to do just that, to allow for, you got this tension between, sharing information if you're a traditional, as you say, gatherer, and the requirements that we have in the Park Service to have more information about what's going on out in the park. And so we're working through some of those tensions. But yes, there is some interest in some other plants, both here as well as with other parks with affiliated Indian tribes as well. Yeah. Yes.
As you're doing your sector studies, looking at impact, were you also looking at what animals, what other species reside there and when and how they're impacted?
Yes, one of the things we're particularly concerned about, and about wildlife biologists have been involved, would be to look at marsh birds, for example. What would be the timing of when the harvesting would occur that would not be disruptive to some of those other important species as well? Yes. Yes.
Is there any systematic effort to connect all of this work to the K through 12 science curriculum?
That would be a wonderful thing, wouldn't it? Yeah, that might be one of the great outcomes that could happen from this project. As I said, this project's being very much led by the gatherers and the consultants in terms of what they want to see happen, in terms of, we definitely would want that as well, but that would be a great result, wouldn't it? To think about different ways of knowing, how we know what we know.
Is there a difference between gathering for personal consumption or private use, tribal use, versus commercial use, that they would sell these baskets or sell the medicines they make? With the National Park care to make that distinction?
Well, that's part of one of the tensions with the regulations, in that commercial activity in parks is prohibited. You're absolutely right. But my understanding of the regs would be that you could gather the grass and you could go make a basket and sell the basket outside of the park. Yes. And I don't know anything about what people do with medicinal plants. I very likely suspect that those aren't sold. Those are probably shared as needed in communities, but I'm just making that up. So, yeah. Okay. So I wanted to, and Abe, thank you for bringing this up, and just point out that we work with so many partners at Acadia, as most national parks do, in order to accomplish what we need to understand how to manage the resources of the park. Science is so important. We issue something in the neighborhood of 85 to 100 research permits every year to afford scientific research in the park. So the park really is a place for science, and science is critical for us. And we have many partners who work with us to help bring that to us. Couple that particularly want to point out, one is Friends of Acadia has a pillar in their strategic plan, which is really important. This notion, we call it Wild Acadia, but it's really about the notion that Friends of Acadia is working with us and helping to leverage capacity for doing science in the park. So, for example, this change thing that's out there, where resources, everything in the park is changing. Things are changing rapidly. They're changing in ways we don't even understand in terms of what we're seeing. So Friends of Acadia is bringing resources to help us with teasing that out by making the assumption that we can't just try to hold things, in the way they used to be, that we need to adapt, and we need to have science to help us understand that. So that's really important. And then the other is that and Abe mentioned the Research Learning Center, the Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. One of the initiatives that they're working on, and this is great, is this called Second Century Stewardship, where they have underwritten by the David Evans Shaw Foundation to support research fellows who are doing science in the park. And one of the criteria for what they do is that what is the management application of the science that they do. So they can propose really interesting science, and we can evaluate it for, this will help us. This will help us with some piece of information that we need to know. And then another piece of this that is so important is the requirement on their part to become science communicators, to be really good communicators of their science. And, we have this problem with science literacy and communication, and it's really an emphasis here at Acadia. If you ever hear Kevin Schneider, our superintendent, talk, he'll talk about the need for science literacy and communication. And so that's, the twin focus is good science, gives us information, but also that it then is communicated out. And we got some wonderful examples. These are the 3 newest cadre of research fellows, and you're going to hear more about their work in the coming year or years. So with that, I will say thank you, and ask Abe a lot of hard questions, okay?
Question on the intertidal zone. Given our ability to wipe out a species by making it so commercially available that we overharvest it, has anybody thought of something we could do with the green crabs to get rid of them?
People are trying. Definitely people are trying different things in terms, you can find cookbooks online for green crab. And so there are people that are trying. It's hard to find something that's viable, and it's also hard to, they're so abundant, it's hard to harvest them at a meaningful amount to really put a dent in their populations. So it is hard to manage threats in the intertidal. We just don't have a lot of tools that are in our toolkit for there. Yeah.
Dave, I'm just curious, kind of where you see science in the park going? Is this something that you're really seeing growing in the future? And if so, kind of what would that look like? Would this be a model for other parks?
Yeah, so we're definitely, I would say, trying to grow science in the park. I think what we're aiming to do is not just grow science. We want more science for sure, but really what we want is what Becky was talking about with the second century stewardship is more kind of a new type of science. So science that's more forward-looking, thinking about how things are changing and how we can anticipate those changes and what we should do about it. And also a new generation of scientists who are comfortable working with managers and also comfortable working with the public, really engaging the public and communicating to the public. So I would say even more so than getting more science, we really want this kind of new kind of science, really forward-looking and using different types of technologies and things like that too. But yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about citizen science, and in particular, there used to be something I heard called like annual bio blitzes where you get a gazillion people looking for a particular bug or a particular plant, and you would do that for one day, and each year you get different things. So you would have maybe 10 different things, and every 10 years you get a snapshot of what's the trend in that critter or plant. So is that still going on?
Yeah, so we have a lot of citizen science in the park. So citizen science is where non-professionals are participating in a meaningful part of the science. It can be just collecting data, or it can be from soup to nuts, doing like designing a project and carrying it out and publishing the results. And here in Acadia and throughout conservation, especially, we need a lot of citizen science because we just don't have enough professionals, in part because we don't have enough professionals to do all the science we need to track all the changes that are happening. And also, we need public engagement in the science so that the public who's voting and making decisions and making local management decisions really understands the things that are happening and how we know what we know. In Acadia, we have several thousand citizen science volunteers every year. Right now, I think our Hawk Watch program is just starting up, so you can go up on Cadillac and help watch the fall migrations of raptors. But what you were talking about is bioblitzes. We did that in Acadia for a number of years, and the Park Service as a whole had a big partnership with National Geographic, where there were thousands of visitors descending on parks, inventorying biodiversity. And what we're doing right now is revisiting that, learning from what we learned over the past 10 years of those bioblitzes, and revising them Here in Acadia, we're likely to be focusing them more on areas where we're doing management. So doing like restorations, like on the top of Cadillac, where we're restoring vegetation up there, or in Sur-de-Mont area where we're also doing some vegetation restoration to it, so that we can assess how well biodiversity is bouncing back after we restore these areas.
Have they ever found a new species of anything?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we found a new species, a wasp, a parasitoid wasp, new to science. In the 2016 BioBlitz here in Acadia. And there were new species found in other parks. They found a new tardigrade at a BioBlitz in Biscayne Bay. So these are like little water bears, little microscopic things. Anyhow, yes, so even in really heavily studied places like Acadia, we're still finding species new to science, absolutely.
You've mentioned the chytrid fungus and salamanders and frogs. Is that here, and what's their prevalence in this area?
Yes, it is here. It doesn't seem to be acting like it does in other places here. It doesn't seem to be harming our amphibian populations. We don't know why. And it's not present in all of our water bodies. So we actually require anybody who's doing wetland research to bleach their shoes when they wander between wetland sites, because in the case that it might end up damaging our amphibian populations. But it is a mystery. That's a mystery that we probably don't have enough people working on right now. But we don't know exactly why it's not behaving like it is in other areas. It's wiped out populations and led to species extinctions entirely in other areas. Yeah.
Hi, question. How do you keep your books on a tidal flat?
You put them really tight, and sometimes you duct tape them at the top.
Yeah, because if you don't, you spend a lot of your time rolling in the mud like I did. There's a science to that, that's for sure. Yes.
If you cut a bat tree in the wintertime, how are they going to survive if there's a bat in there? I mean, in the summertime, they can move somewhere else.
They're not here. They're not in trees in the winter here, fortunately. So the bats that we have here generally will migrate, and they'll spend their winters in warmer climates in those other kinds of winter hibernacula. So.
Yeah, when they overwinter here, I think they're mostly in the rocks.
Yeah.
So.
But much lower numbers of them. So.
Here at the laboratory, in the early part of the last century, there was a biologist, his name was Proctor, part of the Procter and Gamble family.
Yes,
he was he described the flora here to a great extent. And I'm curious, since you brought up another name, to what extent the park is using his records in looking at the changes in the flora.
Yeah, so I don't know about what work he did with the flora, but he certainly inventoried the invertebrate community, so all the insects and even marine invertebrates. And we actually hold his collections at the park. And we've just recently updated all the taxonomy, and we're about to publish that data set, so it's more accessible. And we've compared it with records that have been collected through those more recent bioblitzes that we were talking about. And so we can look at changes in the invertebrate community over that time. And there's just a tremendous amount of change that's happened. Lots of new species, lots of species kind of bopping around. And so the invertebrate community seems to be changing much, much more than other communities that we're watching.
Is that change because of climate change?
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly with the invertebrate, with the insects. It's probably some climate change. It's probably a lot, 3 million people coming here every year and bringing them with them. And also nursery material bopping around. But insects are clearly moving around a lot. And there's a project, even though there's a lot we probably have more species of insects here now than we did 100 years ago, but it's likely, there's a new study looking at abundance of species of insects across Maine, and it's very likely that the abundance of those species have gone down. So even though we have more species, we have fewer insects, we think, in terms of just pure numbers of individuals. But yeah, but the climate change and other things are definitely driving this change. Yeah.
In terms of the recent changes, are there things that you've noticed that you really want to study? What's on the radar?
Change.
Anything specific?
Let's see. You know, a thing that we have been talking, well, one thing is transportation and how to manage people.
Yeah.
So just managing people. So it's actually a very good problem that we have. We have a lot more a recent increase in visitation. We want to be a place where people can connect with nature. That's really important to promoting stewardship. But some of the science we need is just how to manage that visitation in a way that can not damage the park, but also give really good experiences to visitors. Another one that we're concerned about that's been getting talked about a lot recently in the press and things is changes in our forests. So 1 out of every, 6 or maybe even every 4 trees, we have a lot of red spruce in Acadia. So red spruce is like everywhere. Red spruce is not a drought-tolerant species, and we're at the very southern edge of its range in the eastern U.S. And so it is likely to disappear at some point. And we've seen disappearances of like red pine recently. We're likely to see the hemlock disappear as hemlock woolly adelgid gets here, and we might see ash. And so one of our big concerns is how do we manage the changes in the forests as those species kind of roll out? So how do we manage that change? Do we let species kind of passively come in on their own, in which case we're pretty confident that it'll be a lot of invasive species and non-native things, or do we actively manage that? And so we're in a lot of conversations, we're doing a lot of science to figure out, to test different techniques that we might use when the occurrence comes. So that's one of the things that we're spending a lot of time on. Yeah.
There was a question asked earlier about education and sharing the research that you're doing here in the park with K through 12. Is there any conduit for the research to be passed on to the level of students in that environment, and maybe make it more interesting for possible park, employed people, coming up through the high school, and then obviously I think colleges probably would gear more toward your direction, but I would think it'd be starting in the K through 12 groups.
Yeah. Do you want to?
Well, one of the programs the park has, and again, it's supported by Friends of Acadia and others, it's called SEA, it's Scudic Education Adventure. So that's a residential learning opportunity for middle school kids. I believe, 6th graders primarily, and they go and spend 2.5 days with educators and on authentic science. So I think that's a really important place for that kind of thing. And again, to get back to the kind of the science communication piece, I'm really thrilled to tell you that it came in, I think it was in the paper today, that our new Chief of Interpretation and Education is someone named Laura Cohen, her work is around communication. How do we get out these amazing amounts of information in a way that makes it available and usable? So I think there'll be a lot of focus on science communication going forward. I mean, it always has been important. It's just a matter of what's the capacity and how's the best way to translate that science so that it's available to people. And I think that's, part of what the Second Century Stewardship Program is all about, and some of these other initiatives that, we're very aware of that, absolutely, how important it is.
It certainly needs to be inspiring.
Yes, yes.
And we recognize that the Park Service, in terms of science, one of our main roles is storytelling, right? People come to national parks to hear the stories, and the stories of science in national parks get much bigger audiences across the world. And so So that's one of our main roles, and that's where we are spending a lot of energy and where we will continue to invest going forward.
Yeah, I thought I heard once that Acadia is in a unique position in that it's the northern extent of southern creatures, plants and birds and animals, and it's also the southern extreme of northern creatures. So as you do these inventories over time, you see it like a displacement going on. There are more southern creatures showing up and less northern creatures. And is that a general trend that you actually observe?
Yes, yeah, and so it's definitely true that we are at the kind of southern edge, kind of because of our coastal location. We're kind of an odd little extension of boreal forest here, which is the spruce fir forest, and you can see it between here on the MDI. We have a lot of pitch pine, and then on Scudic Peninsula, it's jack pine, which is typical of boreal, and so we really are on that boundary, just on Frenchman Bay, and. But yeah, I mean, the place where you can see the range shifts the most clearly is birds. So we used to have boreal chickadee here, for example, in Acadia. You don't see that here anymore. Now you see just the black-capped chickadee. And going forward, the models suggest that, in the next 70 years, we'll have Carolina chickadee. And there are a number of bird species that you see here, either in the summers only. Turkey vultures weren't here 20 years ago, other things like that. And other species that are spending the winters here because of that, because of the warming temperatures. And so that's probably where it's easiest to see it, is in the birds. Yeah.
When you define something as a native species, what's the beginning date of nativity?
That's a really good question. Well, we know when something's not native, when something, but that's kind of a crucial phenomenological.
It's a hard question, especially when we're expecting change to happen. So we're expecting ranges to shift, right? And because things are warming, we're expecting these southern species to pop up. And so we're having up the coast or up from, plants from Massachusetts to be coming up here. And so I think in the Park Service, we generally think about it as species that are not native to the continent or to the bioregion. But we're having to rethink that and one of the things that, I mentioned we're testing out like how we manage our changing forests. So we're thinking about, do we kind of help plants that wouldn't be able to get here on their own because people have, so say there's a species in Massachusetts or Washington, D.C. or Virginia or somewhere that would be here because as the climate changes but can't make it through all the development. Do we think about transplanting those species up here to facilitate change? And so one of the things we're doing is testing which of those species would behave invasively here. So like black locust is an example of a species that's native to the southeastern U.S., but when you plant it here, it goes bonkers and is crazy. So we're not likely to actively transplant that here. It is used in people's yards and things, but we're not likely to do it. But that's one of the things we're looking at is even native species can behave like invasives. But mostly we think about non-natives as being species that are native to other continents, to Europe and Asia, especially around here.
I know you want to.
Yes, absolutely.
I just wanted to say one thing quickly. If anybody's interested in knowing more about bats from a real bat biologist, who's not me, tomorrow night at the Soms Meynell Wildlife Refuge, Morgan Ingalls, who's our lead bat biologist, is going to be doing a talk at 7 o'clock about literally the real-time kind of bat research that's going on in the park. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Before we thank our speakers for a great presentation, I want to just give you one more plug for our next Science Cafe, which we're going to switch directions dramatically from natural sciences to more about genetics and behavior. When we hear from Dr. Kumar from the Jackson Laboratory about the genetics of addiction. Oh. And so really interesting, timely discussion about some new methods he's looking at in terms of determining susceptibility and potentially treating addiction disorders. So we encourage you all to join us for that. It's September 9th, so 2 weeks, and we look forward to seeing you then. And thank you both for a great presentation.